Hegseth's response to this crisis looks less like leadership and more like incompetence dressed up as confidence. And Trump made it worse by brushing off concerns that deserved serious answers. When military families are raising alarms, you don't shrug, you investigate. Let's look at what happened, because I've got a lot to say about this.
For Hegseth to either be fired or have raised the possibility of impeachment. At the same time, you've got political reporting. The Democratic candidates have made Hegseth a new boogeyman on the campaign trail. They're planning to shift their attacks from President Trump to Hegseth. I wonder sort of what you think about that strategy and what type of pressure it would take for the attention to really turn to Hegseth and his leadership. Amy, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think Hegseth should be a political target for Democrats because he is so incompetent, and it is putting our military at risk. It's putting our country at risk. I mean, his treatment of the military from the start has been terrible. You can talk about all the silly stuff, like the pulling down photos of diversity in the force or the ridiculous dressing down of the top military officers last.
Let's start with what this story is actually about, because a lot of the coverage has gotten it wrong. This is not really about whether every detail in every report on the USS Abraham Lincoln turns out to be 100% accurate. Reports from a warship at sea for 9 months are going to be messy. Some details will be confirmed, some will be disputed. Some will land somewhere in between. That's normal. That's how information works when it's coming out of a chaotic, high-stakes environment. What's not normal, what should actually concern you, is the reaction. When families started coming forward describing food shortages, broken plumbing, water problems, and a mental health situation serious enough,
Year, the admirals and generals that he has not promoted because of their color or gender. But the biggest problem with Pete Hegseth is his incompetence and his lack of integrity. The military doesn't need to be coddled, doesn't need to be treated well even. But what the military needs is a Secretary of Defense who is competent at the top, who is going to make sure that he does the things that only the Secretary of Defense can do, like partnerships and making sure we don't get into a war where we're going to get clobbered strategically. Those are the big things. And the integrity piece is so important. This is a man who has lied about the Strait of Hormuz being open. He's lied about the operation. He's encouraged the military to perform war crimes. He's covered up the casualties of this war. People just don't believe him anymore, and that's why he needs to go.
Right, and Vaughn, what we're hearing from Amy's analysis is so fundamentally different from what we're hearing from President Trump, who's continued to support Hegseth publicly, says he has faith in him. Just take a listen.
That multiple sailors reportedly tried to go overboard. The first instinct out of the Pentagon wasn't, let's find out exactly what's happening and fix it. The first instinct was to declare the entire picture completely misrepresented, without ever explaining, in any detail, what part of it was wrong. Think about that phrase for a second. Completely misrepresented. Not, some of these reports contain errors. Not, here's what actually happened with the food situation, here's what actually happened with the water. Just a blanket dismissal, delivered to reporters, with no specifics attached. Here's the distinction that matters, and it's one this administration keeps blurring. There's a difference between questioning a report and dismissing a problem.
The Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and he's had some good victories lately, I will tell you. He's going to have a lot more. Pete Hegseth, incredible. We have just a great group of people. Pete Hegseth, who was born for this role. I mean, he's doing a great job.
Okay, but fuller context here. You have the reporting that Trump's frustration with the Iran war boiled over at last week's Camp David summit, where he demanded answers on munition shortages. Hegseth was aboard that special decoy flight out of the Middle East, though unlike Trump, he did not sneak aboard. Why this enduring loyalty to Hegseth on the part of the president?
Pete Hegseth is still, Alicia, carrying out the orders of the president himself. This is a war that the president of the United States decided to go forward with.
Questioning a report looks like this. We've seen these accounts. Some details don't match what we're seeing from command. Here's what we can confirm. Here's what we're still verifying. That's normal. That's what accountable leadership sounds like, even when the news is bad. Dismissing a problem looks like what we actually got. A flat denial with no follow-up, no breakdown, no acknowledgement that thousands of sailors have now been at sea for over 250 days without a port call, a fact nobody actually disputes. A competent leader doesn't have to believe every single allegation that lands on their desk. Nobody's asking for that.
And commanded his Pentagon to move forward with these offensive strikes on February 28th. This is something that Donald Trump has suggested would be able to be negotiated, and yet every step of the way, the fault of the continualness of the war has not been the strategy in his mind, but it is the difficulty that is the Iranians' ability to maintain its offensive posture in keeping this war going. And I think that it goes back to people like Mark Esper and James Mattis from the first Trump administration, and the commitment by the transition team this go around to install people into these cabinet positions that would be unyieldingly loyal to him and his wishes. And that's exactly what he got in November of 2024 when he selected Pete Hegseth, right? He made it through narrowly through the confirmation process despite deep reservations from people like veteran Joni Ernst. And so in so many ways, what we're watching transpire now, the president really can't lay at the feet of Pete Hegseth. And I think that that is where the reporting from Priya and from our colleague Lindsay are so relevant to this moment, because it's the human impact stories that are the ones that are hardest to spin. And understanding that soldiers are not in the position to speak out, and their family members are hesitant to do so as well, knowing the potential implications of an administration that has gone after individuals that they deem leakers or individuals who they deem to be seeking to undermine the mission of the American military. We saw them pull the...
But a competent leader should take every serious allegation seriously enough to actually investigate it in public view, not just wave it away and change the subject. And that's really the core of it. When you're the Secretary of Defense and you're handed reports about sailors' mental health, about supply shortages, about people allegedly going overboard on a ship, you're responsible for your first move in front of cameras shouldn't be image management. It shouldn't be, this makes us look bad, let's shut it down. It should be, let's figure out what's true, and let's fix what's broken. Instead, what we got was a press availability where the defense secretary characterized the entire controversy as misrepresented, without walking through a single specific correction. That's not transparency. That's a headline designed to make the story go away, not an answer designed to make the sailors' situation better. And look, if the reporting really was wrong, if families really were exaggerating, if the Navy really has this handled, that's a case that can be made. With facts, with specifics, with a real accounting of what's happening aboard that ship after nearly 9 months at sea. That case was not made. What was made instead was an assertion. And assertions without evidence don't end controversies. They extend them. Hegseth could have contained this with transparency, a real walkthrough of conditions, an honest timeline for when the ship comes home, straight answers about the mental health resources on board. That's all it would have taken to get ahead of this story. Instead, transparency didn't come. And then Trump stepped in. This is where the story stops being about one press conference and starts being about something bigger. When reporters asked President Trump directly whether he was concerned about the mental health of the sailors on the Lincoln and whether families' worries about the ship's conditions were legitimate, his answer wasn't nuanced. It wasn't, "Let me look into that." According to reporting, he said the families weren't concerned, full stop, and when asked if the deployment had gone on too long, he said it hadn't gone on nearly long enough. Now I want to be careful here, because there's a difference between analysis and speculation, and I'm not going to pretend I know what's in the man's head. But here's what I do know. When the President of the United States publicly waves off concerns from military families, not political opponents, not journalists, actual families of the people serving, that's not just a press soundbite. That's a signal. and signals travel through a chain of command. Here's the possible consequence, and it's a legitimate one to worry about, whether or not it was intended. When the commander-in-chief treats concerns from military families as background noise, it can tell everyone underneath him, every officer, every commander, every desk in the Pentagon, that raising problems is not the move. That complaining equals weakness. That flagging a real issue equals disloyalty. That admitting something is broken equals a political embarrassment nobody wants to be responsible for. Nobody has to prove that chain reaction happened for it to be worth asking about. That's the point. What message does that send to the next sailor who has a legitimate concern about safety, or supplies, or their own mental health, and is trying to decide whether it's worth reporting? And here's the contradiction that's hard to ignore. This is an administration that has built a large part of its public identity around being the most pro-military administration in a generation. Constant tributes, constant praise for the troops. And yet, the one moment when actual troops, real sailors, on a real ship, dealing with a real 9-month deployment, needed the administration to take their situation seriously in public, the reflex was to shrug it off. Apparently supporting the troops is easy when the troops aren't asking uncomfortable questions. I'll say that once, and then I'm going to drop the sarcasm, because this isn't a moment for punchlines. It's a moment for a straight question. If the administration genuinely respects what these sailors are going through, and there's no reason to assume they don't, why was the public response to reports of food shortages and mental health strain a denial instead of a briefing? Because here's what happens when the President and the Defense Secretary both respond to a serious set of allegations with dismissal instead of detail. It doesn't make the questions go away. It makes people look for someone who will actually answer them. And that's exactly what opened the door for Congress to step into this story. According to reporting, a group of senators, including every Democratic member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, sent a formal letter demanding that Hegseth account for what's actually happening aboard the Lincoln, the timeline for the ship's return, the operational justification for extending the deployment past its original schedule, whether the crew was told about those extensions in advance, what mental health and medical resources are actually available on board, whether there have been any suicide attempts during the deployment, and if so, how many. Now, I want to be upfront about something, because I think it matters. I don't particularly care that this letter came from Democrats. I don't care whether the demand for answers came from Democrats, Republicans, or the guy selling hot dogs outside the Capitol. If service members are reporting serious conditions on a ship that's been at sea for the better part of a year, somebody in charge owes the country a straight answer. That's not a partisan standard. That's the baseline for accountability in any functioning institution, military or otherwise. And that's really the question worth sitting with. Why did it take a formal congressional letter with all the political theater that comes with it to get any kind of specific accounting? Why did it take journalists at multiple outlets independently reporting the same set of complaints from military families before there was any acknowledgement that something might actually be wrong? If Hegseth and the Pentagon had responded to the initial reports with real detail, a breakdown of the supply situation, an honest account of the mental health resources on board, a clear timeline for relief, there's a real chance this story never escalates into a formal congressional demand at all. Instead, the response was a vague denial, and vague denials don't close stories. They open new ones. Every vague denial creates another question. Every defensive answer creates more suspicion instead of less. Every refusal to provide detail makes the original report look more credible, not less, because if the report really were wrong, the easiest way to prove it would be with specifics. And specifics are exactly what's been missing. Now, to be fair here, Congress demanding answers doesn't automatically prove every allegation in every article is true. It doesn't. Family accounts can be incomplete. Reporting can get details wrong. That's a real possibility, and it should stay on the table. But a formal letter signed by more than a dozen senators does prove something else, that there are legitimate, still open questions that haven't been satisfactorily answered by the people actually responsible for that ship and its crew. And when the people responsible are the ones who could most easily close those questions and choose not to, that silence starts to say something on its own. And that's where this stops being just a story about one aircraft carrier. Let's zoom out, because I think the coverage of this story has mostly missed the bigger picture. This was never really just about how long the deployment lasted, or the specifics of the food supply, or the water situation, or the state of the plumbing on board. Those are serious issues on their own, and they deserve real answers. But underneath all of it is a bigger, more corrosive problem: institutional credibility. Walk through the sequence with me. Service members and their families report serious problems. Journalists at multiple outlets independently investigate and find overlapping accounts. The Secretary of Defense says the entire picture has been misrepresented, without offering specifics. The President dismisses the family's concerns directly, and then Congress has to send a formal letter just to get the administration to engage with the specific details at all. At what point does the public stop asking whether the original report was exaggerated and start asking whether this administration can be trusted when it says everything is fine? That's not a rhetorical trick. That's the actual position we're in right now. Because this administration keeps confusing denial with strength. And those are not the same thing. Strength isn't pretending nothing is wrong. Strength is identifying a real problem, fixing it, and being honest with the public and with the people serving about what happened and what's being done about it. A defense secretary who says, "Here's exactly what went wrong with our supply chain to that carrier, and here's how we're correcting it," looks stronger than one who says, "Everything you heard is fake," and then offers nothing to back that up. Here's the hard part, and it's worth sitting with. If every uncomfortable report gets labeled fake, exaggerated, misrepresented, or politically motivated regardless of the actual facts, eventually the administration creates a problem that's bigger than the original story. Nobody believes the reassurance anymore. Not the next time. Not on the next ship. Not on the next deployment where something actually does go wrong, and somebody in Washington needs the public to trust them when they say it's under control. That's the real cost here. Not one press conference. Not one bad news cycle. A slow erosion of the thing every institution eventually needs, and can't get back easily once it's gone the benefit of the doubt. At the end of the day, this isn't really a story about Pete Hegseth's talking points or Donald Trump's answer to a reporter at Joint Base Andrews. It's a story about leadership, about trust, and about the basic responsibility owed to the men and women who get sent out on 9-month deployments and don't get to hold a press conference of their own. They don't get to tell their side with a podium and a camera crew. All they get is whoever's willing to actually ask the question, and whether the people in charge are willing to give a real answer. So far, on this one, they haven't.